There's a very specific kind of eerie feeling you get standing in a place that used to be full of people having the time of their lives. The rides are rusted, the paint is peeling. Somewhere, a sign that once said "Welcome" now just says "Elcom." Nobody sets out to build a vacation spot with the intention of one day walking away from it. And yet across the country, that's exactly what happened, over and over again, for reasons ranging from hurricanes to bad management to plain old bad luck. America has built and abandoned more vacation destinations than most people realize, and nature has been quietly reclaiming them for decades. So today, we're counting down 13 forgotten vacation spots in America that were left to rot. Number 13, Enchanted Forest, Ellicott City, Maryland. Opening in August of 1955, just about a month after Disneyland debuted on the opposite coast, Enchanted Forest was a storybook-themed park built around nursery rhymes and fairy tales, featuring things like Cinderella's castle, a walk-in shoe belonging to the old woman who lived in a shoe, and a whale named Willie you could climb inside of. The park was the brainchild of local developer Howard Adler, who reportedly got the idea after taking his own kids to visit similar storybook parks elsewhere and figuring Maryland could use one too. At its peak in the late 1970s, the park was pulling in close to 300,000 visitors a summer, which is a lot of people willing to pay $1 to hang out with Humpty Dumpty. By 1989, competition from bigger, flashier, roller coaster-driven parks in the Baltimore area had quietly killed it off. A shopping center was eventually built on part of the original property, which is a fairly blunt way for a fairy tale kingdom to meet its end. The remaining land sat there for over 15 years, slowly rotting into what one blogger memorably described as Candyland after a neutron bomb strike. Weeds grew up through Cinderella's castle, paint peeled off the old woman's giant shoe, and for years the only regular visitors were teenagers looking for a strange place to hang out, and photographers drawn to the specific kind of decay that only a fairy tale theme park can produce. Most of the figures have since been rescued by a dedicated preservation society formed by former visitors and relocated to a nearby farm for restoration, with several pieces occasionally put on public display during community events so longtime locals can see the old statues up close again. But for over a decade, this fairy tale wonderland just sat there decomposing behind a shopping center, which is somehow both funny and a little sad at the same time. Number 12. Chippewa Lake Park, Ohio. Chippewa Lake Park ran for exactly 100 years, from 1878 to 1978, making it one of the longest continuously operating amusement parks in American history before it finally closed for good. It had 3 roller coasters, including a wooden coaster known as the Big Dipper, a ballroom, a famous Ferris wheel that was, at one point, the fastest in the country, and one of only a handful of surviving tumble bug rides left on the planet. When the park shut down after failing to compete with nearby giants like Cedar Point, nobody bothered to tear anything down. The rides were simply left standing exactly where they were, and for the next 45 years, the forest slowly grew up and around them. The old casino and dance hall building, one of the last major structures still standing on the property, eventually burned down in a fire in the early 2000s, taking with it one of the few remaining links to the park's ballroom-era heyday. Visit today, or at least until recent redevelopment plans took hold, and you'd find a rusted Ferris wheel standing silently in the trees, with a tree literally growing up through the center of it, less an amusement park at this point than a monument to what happens when nobody comes back to lock the gate. The old wooden coaster structures, left completely unmaintained for decades, slowly collapsed into the forest floor on their own, and photographers who've documented the site over the years have noted how the tree line has crept in so far that some rides are barely visible from just a few feet away in the summer months, with entire sections only becoming visible again once the leaves drop in late fall. In recent years, a local development group has floated plans to clear sections of the site for lakeside housing, which would mean the end of what urban explorers have treated for decades as a kind of pilgrimage site, and would close the book on one of the longest-running amusement parks the country ever had. Number 11. Rocky Point Park, Rhode Island. For nearly 150 years, starting in the 1840s, Rocky Point Park was the place to be in Rhode Island, drawing crowds so large that the local railway built a dedicated line straight to the entrance. The park was also famous for its shore dinner hall, a massive clam bake operation capable of feeding thousands of visitors at a sitting. And for a lot of Rhode Islanders, a trip to Rocky Point simply meant a plate of clam cakes and chowder as much as it meant rides. By the mid-20th century, it had a corkscrew coaster, a log flume, and a ride called the Free Fall that dropped riders 13 stories at 55 miles an hour, which is either thrilling or completely unreasonable, depending on your relationship with gravity. The park closed in 1995 due to financial mismanagement, and the following year, its parent company filed for bankruptcy. What followed wasn't a peaceful decline, so much as a series of suspicious fires, the first of which torched the park's main building in 2004, at a time when the structure reportedly had no electricity running through it at all. Most of the rides were eventually auctioned off in 1997 and sold piece by piece to other parks around the country, scattering what had once been a single Rhode Island institution across half a dozen states. The shore dinner hall itself, which had fed generations of Rhode Islanders their clam bakes, was demolished not long after the fires, closing the door on a tradition some locals had grown up with their whole lives. By 2014, the whole property had been converted into a quiet, unremarkable state park, the kind of place where you'd never guess 13-story freefalls once happened here, and where the only real clue anything ever stood on the land is the occasional chunk of old foundation still poking up through the grass along the walking trails. Number 10. Joyland Amusement Park, Wichita, Kansas. Joyland ran for 55 years starting in 1949, built originally by the Nelson family to give their 12-inch gauge miniature steam train a permanent home, and it eventually grew into the largest amusement park in central Kansas, complete with a wooden roller coaster nicknamed the Nightmare, a log flume called the Big Splash, and a dark ride called the Wacky Shack. For generations of Wichita kids, this was simply what summer meant. After closing in 2004 and briefly reopening under new management in 2006, Joyland shut its gates for good and was never revived. What followed was a slow, ugly unraveling. Repeated fires, including one that gutted the park's opera house in 2009, relentless vandalism, and in 2015, a serious accident when a teenager trespassing on the property fell from an abandoned ride and suffered a punctured lung. The park's owner, Margaret Nelson, summed up the situation with a level of honesty that's hard not to respect, saying simply, "We're sick. Our hearts are just sick." By 2017, the safety concerns and continued break-ins had gotten bad enough that most of the remaining structures, including the once iconic Nightmare coaster, were finally demolished, leaving behind mostly memories, a few salvaged rides scattered elsewhere, and an empty field where the largest amusement park in the region used to stand. A handful of the carousel horses and smaller ride pieces were bought by collectors and local museums before demolition crews moved in, so a small piece of Joyland technically survives, just scattered across private garages and historical society storage rooms instead of the midway where it belonged for over half a century. Number 9. Miracle Strip Amusement Park, Panama City Beach, Florida. For over 4 decades, starting in 1963, Miracle Strip was the anchor of Panama City Beach's tourist strip, founded by the Dickinson family and built around the Starliner, Florida's very first wooden roller coaster, along with attractions with names like Dante's Inferno and the Abominable Snowman. Generations of families made this the centerpiece of their beach vacations, right up until competition and a post-9/11 slump in tourism finally caught up with it. The park closed for good on September 5, 2004, and then sat completely untouched. For over a decade, the land simply remained vacant, an empty lot 1 block from the ocean in one of Florida's busiest tourist corridors, which is a genuinely strange thing to leave sitting around unused for that long in prime beachfront real estate. A smaller, nostalgia-driven version of the park briefly reopened for a few seasons inside a nearby shopping and entertainment complex, using the same name and a handful of surviving kiddie rides. But it never came close to recapturing the scale of the original and eventually closed again as well. The original site and the original Starliner are long gone, dismantled, and put in storage after a brief and unsuccessful second life at another park entirely. For years afterward, the empty lot became something of a local landmark in its own right, a stretch of prime beachfront that longtime residents would point to and simply say, "That used to be Miracle Strip," which is its own strange kind of legacy for a piece of land that technically has nothing left standing on it at all. Number 8. Lake Shawnee Amusement Park, West Virginia. Here's where things get genuinely unsettling. Lake Shawnee opened in the 1920s on land near Princeton, West Virginia, complete with a Ferris wheel, a swimming pool, and a dance hall. All built without anyone realizing the property sat on top of what turned out to be an ancient burial ground, along with the site of a documented 18th century massacre involving the local Clay family and members of the Shawnee tribe. The park itself had its own run of tragedy. A young girl killed when a delivery truck struck the swing ride she was on, a young boy who drowned in the man-made pool, and several additional deaths over the years. It failed a health inspection and closed in the 1960s, reopened briefly under new ownership in the 1980s, and closed again for good not long after. When the new owner, Bill Cole, later attempted to develop the land into a residential neighborhood, construction crews unearthed skeletal remains, mostly children, at which point the plan to build homes there was, understandably, abandoned entirely. The site has since drawn attention from paranormal investigators and television crews, including at least one cable ghost hunting show that filmed an episode on the property, which only added to its reputation. The rusted Ferris wheel and children's swing set still stand, half swallowed by grass and rust, and the Cole family now runs seasonal, appointment-only haunted tours through the property, which honestly feels like the most appropriate use of the land at this point. Visitors on those tours are typically walked past the small marked graves near the tree line before being shown the rides themselves, a deliberate choice that keeps the focus on the site's history rather than just the spookiness of an abandoned carnival. Number 7. Holyland USA, Waterbury, Connecticut. Built largely by volunteers using cinder blocks and repurposed materials starting in 1955, Holyland USA was a Catholic-themed attraction on top of a hill overlooking Waterbury, featuring a replica of Bethlehem, scenes from Scripture, and Stations of the Cross scattered across 18 acres. Founder John Baptist Greco was a lawyer by trade who ran the site as a non-profit rather than a for-profit business, and the massive illuminated cross erected on the hillside, standing roughly 56 feet tall, is still visible from the interstate today and remains one of the most recognizable landmarks in the city. At its peak, the attraction drew around 40,000 visitors a year, enough that Waterbury picked up a reputation as something like a small pilgrimage town. Greco closed the park in 1984, intending to renovate and expand it, but he died 2 years later before any of that happened, and with no one willing to take over the project, the site was left to decay for roughly 3 decades. Vandalism became such a persistent problem that in 2010, the abandoned park became the site of a teenager's murder, a tragedy that only deepened the site's grim reputation. In 2013, the local mayor and a business partner purchased the property and led a community restoration effort through a non-profit called Family of Mary, and the park partially reopened the following year, though it never came close to reclaiming what it once was during its Cold War-era peak. Restoration work has continued gradually since then, mostly funded through small donations and volunteer labor, rather than any large-scale investment, which means the site today sits somewhere between a functioning attraction and a very slowly healing ruin. Number 6. Dogpatch USA, Arkansas. Built around Al Cap's hillbilly comic strip, Lil Abner, and opened in 1968 on the site of a former trout farm in the Ozarks, Dogpatch USA leaned all the way into its rural theme, with attractions called things like Barney Barnsmell's Skunk Works and mechanical trash eaters designed to look like pigs eating garbage out of visitors' hands, alongside the trout fishing that had originally drawn tourists to the property before the theme park was even built. In its first year alone, it drew around 300,000 people, a strong start for what was essentially a theme park built entirely around a comic strip about hillbillies. Things went downhill from there. The broader culture's fascination with rural sitcoms faded fast in the 1970s. An energy crisis hurt family road trips, and a sister ski resort built nearby lost money because Arkansas winters simply weren't cold enough to sustain it. The park also increasingly struggled to compete with Silver Dollar City, just across the state line in Branson, Missouri, which offered a similar rustic Ozark theme with considerably deeper pockets behind it. After multiple ownership changes, bankruptcy filings, and a name change meant to dodge licensing fees, once the Lil Abner trademark became complicated, the park finally closed for good in 1993. What followed was nearly 3 decades of collapse, with buildings caving in and train tracks disappearing under weeds, an eBay listing in 2002 that tried and failed to sell the whole property for a flat $1 million, and, more recently, purchased by the CEO of Base Pro Shops with plans to turn the land into a nature park instead. Urban explorers who've documented the site over the years describe entire buildings still furnished with 1970s fixtures, gift shop shelving, and faded signage, essentially untouched since the day the gates closed, which is rare for a property that's been abandoned for as long as this one has. Number 5. Discovery Island, Walt Disney World, Florida. Most people don't realize Walt Disney World has its own abandoned island sitting right in the middle of it. Opened in 1974 and originally themed as Treasure Island before being rebranded Discovery Island in 1977, this 11.5-acre landmass in Bay Lake operated as an actual zoological park, home to toucans, flamingos, giant tortoises, lemurs, and one of the largest walk-through aviaries in the world at the time. The island wasn't without controversy, even while it was open. In 1994, several former Discovery Island employees were arrested and charged with animal cruelty after allegations surfaced involving the deaths of dozens of animals on the property, though the case ultimately fell apart and the charges were dropped, leaving the full story murkier than the headlines at the time suggested. Discovery Island quietly closed on April 8, 1999. After 25 years of operation, its animals relocated elsewhere in the resort, most notably to the newly built Animal Kingdom. Since then, the island has simply sat there, visible from boats and nearby resorts, but completely off-limits, patrolled by security and sealed off from any kind of public access. Though that hasn't stopped a steady trickle of urban explorers over the years, from sneaking onto the island by boat and posting footage of the decaying aviary structures and empty animal enclosures online. Disney has never said much publicly about its long-term plans for the land, and for a company that famously accounts for every square inch of its property, down to the smallest detail, that silence is a little conspicuous. Aerial photos and leaked explorer footage over the years have shown the old aviary netting still standing, sagging under 2 decades of Florida weather, along with pathways and signage slowly being swallowed by the same subtropical growth that made the island such a lush attraction in the first place. Number 4. Disney's River Country, Florida. Just across the water from Discovery Island sits River Country, Disney's very first water park, which opened in 1976 with a rustic, old-fashioned swimming hole theme, complete with water slides, an inner tube river, and a sand-bottom lake fed directly by the adjacent Bay Lake. It was, for a while, genuinely groundbreaking, and its popularity is part of what convinced Disney to eventually build both Typhoon Lagoon and Blizzard Beach. The park's reputation took a serious hit in 1980, years before its eventual closure, when a young boy swimming in the lake-fed water contracted a rare and almost always fatal brain-eating amoeba infection and died shortly afterward, a case that drew national health scrutiny toward natural swimming venues like River Country in general. Disney continued operating the park for another 2 decades, but attendance gradually dropped off once guests had flashier, more heavily filtered options at the newer parks, and River Country closed in November of 2001 for what was announced as a routine winter refurbishment that simply never ended. For the next 17 years, River Country sat there rotting, the closing announcement theme still looping on a speaker system Disney never bothered to shut off, lights automatically flicking on and off each night because nobody cut the power either. Disney didn't officially confirm the closure was permanent until 2005, and demolition of what remained didn't happen until 2019, clearing the way for a new resort hotel. In the years between, River Country became something of a legend among Disney fans and urban explorers, a handful of whom managed to slip past security and document the park's slow decay. From slides overtaken by moss to the sand-bottom lake area, completely reclaimed by weeds and wildlife, footage that circulated online long after most guests had forgotten the park ever existed. Number 3. Grossinger's Catskill Resort Hotel, New York. At its peak, Grossinger's wasn't just a hotel, it was practically a small city, spanning over 1,000 acres in Liberty, New York, complete with its own airport, post office, and 600 guest rooms. As the crown jewel of the so-called Borscht Belt, the network of Jewish resorts that flourished in the Catskills from the 1920s through the 1960s, Grossinger's hosted everyone from Milton Berle to Elizabeth Taylor, and in 1952 became the first resort in the world to use artificial snow on its ski slopes. Under the guidance of matriarch Jenny Grossinger, the resort also became a training destination for professional athletes, most famously boxer Rocky Marciano, who prepared for several of his fights at the hotel's on-site gym. Cheap air travel changed everything. As flights to Florida and the Caribbean became affordable for the same families who once drove up from New York City every summer, resorts like Grossinger's watched their business quietly evaporate. The hotel closed for good in 1986, and multiple attempts to revive it over the following decades, including a proposed casino, all collapsed. The buildings sat abandoned for over 30 years, slowly rotting until most of what remained was finally demolished in 2018, with the last standing structure destroyed in a massive fire in 2022. Photographers who explored the property before demolition documented ballrooms with peeling wallpaper still hanging where celebrities once danced, an indoor pool slowly filling with debris, and guest rooms left exactly as they were the day the resort closed. A snapshot of mid-century American luxury quietly dissolving room by room. It's often cited as an inspiration for the setting of the movie Dirty Dancing, which came out 1 year after the real place shut its doors for good, and longtime Catskills historians still consider Grossinger's the clearest example of just how completely the Borscht Belt's golden age has vanished. Number 2. Six Flags New Orleans, Louisiana. Opened as Jazzland in the year 2000 and rebranded Six Flags New Orleans after a 2003 acquisition, this 200-plus acre park in New Orleans East had barely gotten its footing before Hurricane Katrina hit in August of 2005. Floodwaters submerged the park under as much as 12 feet of water for weeks, ruining the electronics on rides like the wooden coaster Mega Zephyr. And by 2006, Six Flags officially declared the property a total loss and tried to walk away from its lease with the city. That attempt to exit only kicked off a lengthy legal fight between Six Flags and the city of New Orleans over who actually owed what on the land, a dispute that dragged on for years and helped stall any real redevelopment, with both sides pointing fingers over lease obligations while the park itself just sat there rusting in the Louisiana humidity. Plan after plan surfaced to redevelop the site, a shopping mall, a water park, a hotel and movie studio complex, only to collapse for one reason or another, year after year, while the rusted roller coasters sat exactly where the floodwaters left them. Alligators, wild boars, and vultures eventually moved in among the rides. As one Washington Post columnist bluntly summed it up, the site had become decrepit, tragic, infested with alligators, a description that's difficult to argue with. Demolition finally began in late 2024, nearly 2 full decades after the storm, clearing the way for a new mixed-use development that, at this point, everyone will believe when they see it. In the meantime, the abandoned park became something of a dark pop culture landmark, showing up in music videos, film shoots, and countless urban exploration channels, turning a genuine natural disaster site into, somewhat uncomfortably, one of the most photographed ruins in the entire country. Number 1. Neva Lodge, Lake Tahoe. And here's the one that might sting the most, because this wasn't some regional attraction. It was a genuine playground for the most famous people in America. Built in 1926 on the California-Nevada border, literally split down the middle by a line painted through the dining room and swimming pool, Cal Neva became legendary in the 1960s under partial ownership by Frank Sinatra, who added a showroom for the Rat Pack, decorated an entire section known as the Indian Room, and reportedly used old Prohibition-era tunnels beneath the property to move guests around unseen. Marilyn Monroe stayed there just days before her death in 1962. Judy Garland performed in the showroom, and John and Robert Kennedy were known to visit as well, making the lodge a genuine crossroads of Hollywood, politics, and organized crime, all under one roof. Sinatra lost his gaming license in 1963 after mob figure Sam Giancana was discovered on the property, and the lodge changed hands repeatedly over the following decades, cycling through several ownership groups in the 1980s and 90s alone, none of whom quite managed to recapture its golden era glamour. It finally closed for good in 2010 after a foreclosure auction drew no bidders. A renovation attempt in 2013 fell apart when the developer went bankrupt mid-project, leaving the historic lodge, showroom, and circle bar sitting empty and deteriorating for well over a decade, weather damage steadily working through a building that once hosted some of the most photographed people on the planet. A new ownership group now has plans to reopen it in 2027 as a modern resort, which means one of America's most iconic and most neglected vacation spots might finally get the ending it deserves, assuming this attempt actually sticks. Until then, the lodge has continued to draw a steady trickle of history buffs and Rat Pack enthusiasts to its front gate, most of them content just to stand on the property line, the same one Sinatra used to walk guests across for laughs, and imagine what the place looked like when it was actually full of people. So that's 13 places that used to mean something to somebody, 13 spots where families made memories that, in some cases, are now genuinely difficult to picture, given what's left behind. Whether it's hurricanes, bankruptcy, bad timing, buried history, or just plain bad luck, it turns out America has a real talent for building something wonderful, and then simply walking away from it, leaving the rest of us to wander through what's left with a phone camera and a slightly uneasy feeling. What's striking, looking at all 13 together, is how differently the story ends each time. Some sites bulldozed and forgotten within a few years, others left standing for decades as accidental monuments, and a couple, like Holyland USA and Cal Neva, still fighting for a second chance even now. If you liked this one, go ahead and hit that like button, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.